Okay, hello everyone. My name is Luke Jennings. I'm VP of R&D at Push Security, and I'm here to talk to you about understanding the new SaaS cyber kill chain. So briefly, how I came to this project in the first place. I very much came from an offensive security background, sort of pen testing, red teaming, offensive security research at a company called MWR, if you're familiar with any old work. I then moved into the detection response space, sort of EDR design, threat hunting, that kind of thing. But then joining Push Security, I've focused entirely basically on identity attacks and SaaS security research since then. So I pretty much had to throw out almost everything I knew from everything I'd done before and start on the problem of like how do you compromise an organization without touching the endpoint. So we're going to do a little brief history of where we got to here and talk about SaaS adoption, and then we'll jump right in with the attacks and we'll look at sort of different kill chain phases and go through some attack examples. We'll look at the sort of new kill chain there, some of the new techniques, some new flavors of old techniques, and then we'll look at chaining it all together at the end with some demos of attacks. So, if we think about which era we're in now, like if I look at this, I kind of got into the industry in the 2000s, for example. Like I look back now and I'm like, okay, that was the perimeter hacking years, right? That was the port scanners, the vuln scanners, web app attacks, all that kind of thing. And then firewalls and DMZs and patch managements and all that came along, and that made it much more tricky. And then we entered the 2010s, and the endpoint became the new perimeter. People realized there was all this attack surface on the endpoint, and we moved a lot more towards like phishing for endpoint compromises, so like Office macro exploits, file format exploits. It was very much about like getting a memory resident implant running on an endpoint and a command and control framework to exploit that and then to move around the network laterally. And since then, obviously, we've seen like the entire EDR market be created for a start, which is a gigantic market in itself. And then we've got SIMs and red teaming and threat hunting and all those kind of good things. And endpoints are getting harder as well. And I think now, like, I mean, this has already happened, but I think cloud identities are basically the new perimeter now. And if in 5-10 years, if we look back, it's the question mark is just going to be what are the techniques of the day going to turn out to be, and what's the sort of main industry response going to be. So what drives shifts in attacks? Okay. So I kind of alluded to this before, but there's generally two areas. One of them is just improved security controls. So we saw that in the past with things like firewalls and VPNs and patch management. The other aspect, so the improved security controls kind of led to endpoint attacks becoming more normal because people got pushed away from the perimeter attacks before. But the other aspect is technological shifts. And we saw that before with like new attack surface in the old days from things like complex web applications and Wi-Fi. And in more recent years, things like remote working and SaaS native organizations has introduced a new attack surface that wasn't there before. And I think at the moment, we've kind of got both these things happening where endpoint attacks are getting harder and we've seen a radical shift, technological shift in the way organizations work. And that's pushing a shift in attacks. So on the sort of SaaS adoption side, we've obviously seen lots of adoption in the last few years. I mean, this is actually even only goes up to 2022 now. We've seen a case where now most organizations are using a lot of SaaS apps. Even if they don't know about it, shadow SaaS usage is a big problem too, particularly in enterprises where product-led growth of SaaS applications often means that lots of teams will just start using them without central IT procurement and so forth. So this is just creating a lot more attack surface. And on the startup front, a lot of people are just SaaS first now. Like Push Security as a company, we've always been this way. We don't have any offices, we don't have any infrastructure. Everything is like cloud identity based, SaaS app based. All of our production software is in AWS serverless kind of land. So it's very much that way, and that's obviously the way we're seeing shifts in organizations' working patterns. Something's going strange with the slides. Okay. So, how has infrastructure changed? Forgive my very basic network diagram here. Let's say if we're looking at endpoint attacks, we generally had something like this. We have an internal network, we have a DMZ. We'd expose some things on the DMZ to the internet for whatever their purposes might be. And then on the internal network, we'd have protected servers. We'd have our laptops and desktops connecting to those. And then if we had remote workers, we'd have them connecting through the firewall to a VPN to achieve the same. And then when we're dealing with an endpoint compromise, effectively, we just have, a laptop gets compromised, and then it will communicate out to the internet, outbound through the firewall to a command and control server. But now, when we're dealing with the SaaS world, we've got something that looks very different. We've got generally pretty hardened endpoints, often just sitting on the internet, whether that be on someone's home Wi-Fi connection or in Starbucks or wherever they are, and they're connecting directly to SaaS applications. Those applications themselves may have connections between them too, through things like OAuth for data sharing. There may also be like identity providers providing gateways to some of them, but you have something that looks a lot more like this. And for a more modern organization like my own that's purely this way, the right side of this diagram is effectively all we have. And for a lot of enterprises out there, both of these sides exist, so we've kind of got this hybrid situation. Okay, so moving on to the attacks. I started out asking myself this question, like how do you compromise an organization without touching an endpoint? And I thought the first point is like thinking just about the kill chain phases. So I thought I'd use like MITRE attack phases, for example, as a basis. I thought, has that changed? And I think looking at it at that level, like broadly, most of them apply in the same way. I think the one thing that doesn't really apply in the same way anymore is maybe command and control. That's very network filtering focused and getting around network segmentation, that kind of thing. Given the nature of SaaS applications in the cloud now, we don't really have those controls in the same way. So I don't think that exists quite the same. But most of them exist in a fairly similar way. Execution, I would say, has changed significantly, but still exists, and we'll come to that in more detail later. So once I got to that point, it was then a case of looking at what attacks fit into these, like what older attacks have new flavors in this world, and what new attacks, or fundamentally new attacks, might exist. So I obviously don't have time in this whole presentation to go through every phase and every type of attack. What we're going to do is focus on a few key phases, look at some basic techniques, look at some older techniques and how they apply here, and then look at some newer techniques. I'm going to start very briefly with recon. In a traditional world, I would have thought of this as things like port scanning and service enumeration, and maybe in the endpoint space, like enumerating valid email addresses to target and other details about users for social engineering. But in the SaaS native space, this is quite different. Now it's about SaaS discovery, about cloud identity enumeration, about SSO and identity provider enumeration. So it's like, what SaaS apps is an organization using that I might want to target? Where are the cloud identities living that allow access to those? Are there SSO portals in front of them and identity providers that are gateways to those? That's the sort of recon phase. So you get really simple things like where there might have been username enumeration in the past in web apps. In the SaaS world, you might have things like SAML enumeration. You might go to a SaaS app and find for a given domain that it's been configured for SAML authentication to another provider, in this case maybe Okta. So I'm using Ramp as an example here, and a company that is on their website as being a user. I can see through their APIs that via the login process that they have SAML configured for that domain, and it redirects to a particular Okta instance. That's a form of recon here. I can say, okay, clearly they're a user of this app, and this is their SSO portal for it. Also, you have other simple techniques like what I call slug tenant enumeration. Often with SaaS apps, you need to configure a new tenant. Sometimes you have to name that. It's a little bit like naming a domain. And similar story for a company that's acknowledged as being a user of Bamboo HR, SoundCloud. You can see that that's already registered. Now, there's no guarantee that really is SoundCloud. Anyone can register a name. But in this case, then you see that someone has registered it, and it takes you to a login portal. And then you can also see other details, like that's been configured to allow Google social logins as well as direct email and password logins. So that's like another kind of common basic form of recon in this space. And doing those sort of things can give you a picture of where the attack surface is in this space for an organization. Okay, so moving on to initial access, here's generally where people get most interested because it's the first compromise point. So traditionally, I would have been thinking of this as phishing for an endpoint compromise, Office macro exploits, that kind of thing. Here, it's very different. We're talking about compromising cloud identities at the end of the day, gaining access to SaaS applications and identities in the process. And some of the ways of doing this are very old techniques that just work in slightly different ways. Things like credential stuffing, that's been around forever, but it works in a slightly different way here. Slight variations on phishing, so things like consent phishing or different delivery vehicles for phishing, like instant messenger applications in the cloud, or using things like attacker in the middle and browser in the middle phishing attacks to try and bypass tight MFA controls on identity providers, using tools like Evil Jinx or Evil NuVNC or something like that. So that's in general how this sort of phase has changed. So we'll look at some of those basic ones first. So things like credential stuffing, as I said before, credential stuffing has been around since the dawn of time, but in the not too distant past, we were looking generally at like one or two sort of endpoints to try that against. Maybe you had a webmail endpoint for external users, and maybe you had a VPN endpoint, and you have tight authentication controls there. Now we've got the situation where a company might have hundreds of SaaS applications in use. They're not all going to be behind SSO. Many of them might have been self-adopted. So you've got all these different places where cloud identities can exist. So if someone's got weak passwords, or their passwords get compromised through some sort of dump or phishing attack, attackers now have a lot of different places to try those against. They won't all have MFA, they won't have tight controls, you might not have login visibility of all of those. So I think it's really just amplified the risk of a very old school weakness and attack technique. The other thing is things like consent phishing. So here the trick being that we use OAuth to gain access to permissions on behalf of the user. So instead of trying to phish for credentials, we are asking them to consent to allow access to their data. Like that could be their email, that could be their files. One of the nice things from an attacker's perspective is it often uses legitimate URLs, like legitimate Microsoft URLs, legitimate Google URLs, for example. It grants permanent access generally, so it doesn't matter once the user changes their password, you'll maintain your access there. And things like MFA don't really provide any extra protection because it's not based on authentication. Like even phishing-resistant MFA doesn't really matter because it's not about authentication, it's about granting privileges. So I think this is something that affects a lot of SaaS apps, because a lot of SaaS apps are based on utilizing OAuth to share data between them, so we then have the option as an attacker of launching consent phishing type attacks. In the delivery space, we've got IM phishing and spoofing, and that opens a lot of options. So we're used to, for many years, most phishing attacks coming via email, or maybe SMS as well, and generally being something involving a link. Once things like Slack and Teams became really popular, they were internal only to begin with, but obviously they were so useful that then we got things like Slack Connect and Teams external access. Now you can sort of spoof other companies and try and make access requests into organizations and do even external phishing as well as internal phishing via them. There are lots of options for sort of hiding links and spoofing previews. So like that left-hand image there is it looks like it's a link to our website from one of our blog posts, but in reality that's just link preview spoofing. If you click on it, it takes you to a phishing website instead. You can kind of pretend to be whoever you are, and if you want to have like conversations quickly on IM, that's easy to do to build the rapport before launching an attack later. So that's like another place where I think it's causing phishing to evolve, and obviously there's often not as much visibility as there would have been through like secure mail gateways in the past through mechanisms like this. Okay, so they're like the slightly new flavors of the old. Here's something a bit new. This one I called poison tenants. So the idea here is that rather than try to gain access to an organization's SaaS applications, you can use SaaS applications to attack an organization. And with a poison tenant, the idea is you set up your own tenant for a SaaS application and try to convince different users of the organization to come on board on that tenant to launch further attacks. The benefit of this is often there'll be like invite functionality. So you often can cause emails, legitimate emails to come from a SaaS vendor to invite someone to join. So in this case, we're using Neuclino, a SaaS-based wiki. And then those links are pointing obviously to a legitimate SaaS application as well. And the idea is you try and social engineer users to get on your tenant. Now, I'd love to say obviously you could convince someone to do this to migrate to your Slack tenant, your malicious Slack tenant, and as an attacker you've then got admin control of all communications. Obviously that's not really a realistic prospect for something that's such a core tool, but for more around the peripheries, say it's some kind of application that marketing might be looking to use, and as an attacker you found that out, there's more opportunities to get limited number of teams involved and get them on board. Now it could be that if you get them into your tenant and then they start using it, they might be sharing data inside that's of interest to you. Or it could be something that is just used to launch second stage attacks. It could just be a meme generator that is not taking business data, no one's thinking or worrying about, but you can combine it with other attacks to be more effective later, and we're going to see an example of that shortly. Because I'm going to combine it with something called samuljacking. So samuljacking is another interesting case where you try to use something good for bad. So SAML obviously is a protocol for allowing SSO authentication. It's a good thing. But what it does mean is during the login process, an application will redirect somewhere else to execute that SAML flow. Now, if you control a SaaS application tenant, whether it's one you've set up yourself or if you've somehow compromised the SaaS application tenant, you can change those settings, right? So I can go, and in this case, this is a Nuclino-based wiki. I could say have my own Nuclino tenant, and I can set it up to redirect to basically a phishing site instead of executing a SAML flow. So I get something that looks like this. Someone goes to my Nuclino tenant on a legitimate domain, and then they get a login page, and it says, oh, this tenant's been set up for SSO. Do you want to click the button to do SSO? So they say yes. Then they get redirected to my phishing site, which in this case is just a Google phishing site. But the point is, for a lot of people, they've already gone through that process of determining whether it's legitimate by that point. They've looked at the URLs previously that were legitimate, and then they're at a point when they're expecting to enter credentials, expecting to get redirected to some SSO mechanism, then they get phished. So it's quite clever from a perspective of taking advantage of what people normally expect the flow to be and where they normally expect to be suspicious of domains and so forth. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show like a combination of using poison tenants combined with SAML jacking as an interesting initial access vector. So I've got a demo now that is quite complicated to go through. So it's one I've pre-narrated. So I'm just going to sit back and let this play and then come back.
For step one of the attack, we've set up a poison tenant in Nuclino, and we're now going to use the built-in email invite functionality to invite our target users. We enter their email address, we click to invite, and then Nuclino will send an email to that user from its own domains, inviting them to our poison tenant. If we then look at our team settings, we'll see that there is a pending invite for that user, waiting for them to respond to the invite they've had. For step two of the attack, we're going to look at the target user now who's received the email invite from Nuclino. And we can see that it's from a legitimate Nuclino domain, not from an attacker-controlled domain. So when the target user clicks the button to join, they're then prompted to enter their details in order to create an account as the first step. And once they've done that, so basically a one-step process, they then have an account with Nuclino, and they are then automatically joined to the poison tenant. For the final step of the attack chain, we will look at the SAML jacking portion. Here we are looking at the configuration panel for SSO settings for the poison tenant. We've configured them to point to an ngrok domain that we control for testing purposes. Obviously, an attacker could register a more convincing domain if they so wish. We're now going to click to enforce SSO logins, which will result in Nuclino prompting existing users by email to link their accounts to their SSO identity. Looking at the email the target receives, we can see it's a legitimate email from Nuclino domains with a link that points to a Nuclino domain, so there's no real cause for suspicion. The first path to compromise is if the target responds to this email directly. Clicking the button in the email, we can see we are immediately redirected to our malicious SSO server, and that shows us a fake Google login page in this case. If the user enters their credentials here, then the attack is complete. Alternatively, the target may not see the email or may not immediately respond to it and continue to use their authenticated session with Nuclino. Eventually, this session will expire, which we are going to simulate in this case just by logging out. This will cause existing tabs and links to redirect back to the tenant-specific login page. We can see this now has a large button prompting to log in via SSO. If the user clicks this button to log in now, then they are immediately directed to our malicious SSO page where they can enter their credentials for capture.
Okay, so we see how that's two sort of newer types of attacks, and if you combine them in that way, then you get something that's quite an interesting sort of social engineering vector for for initial access. I'm going to move now on to persistence, which is a phase that's really quite interesting from my perspective in this new world. I think there's a lot of options for persisting now. And to be honest, I wouldn't want to be an incident responder dealing with some of this anymore. But if we look at the traditional side here, I'm thinking about endpoint persistence, run keys, of which there's a million types on Windows, scheduled task services, that kind of thing. In SaaS native world, we're talking about SaaS-based persistence or sort of identity-based persistence. So it's like once you've compromised an application or a cloud identity, how do you maintain access to it? There are a whole range of techniques. Some of them are super simple things we'll look at in a second, like just API keys and link sharing and something called ghost logins. But also OAuth is really useful to this. We looked at it for consent phishing before, but with OAuth, I'm going to look at how we use this for persistence as well, and how it can be used in slightly different ways for that. Most people normally talk about consent phishing with OAuth, but it has multiple uses. So like link sharing is just, it's what you've seen that you're all familiar with. Things like Google Drive, OneDrive often enable ways of sharing files or folders with users outside of your tenant. It's pretty normal functionality. People use it all the time. But if you're an attacker and you gain access to an account and you've got files or folders you're interested in, you could just share those, keep hold of those links. If you get kicked out of that account later, it gives you a way of coming back in. Now, at least with Google Drive and OneDrive, it's normally fairly visible what's been shared. But realistically, I don't think many people are paying that much attention here. It's so common for things to be shared. I don't think people are carefully paying attention to this. But it's not just those. There's lots of other SaaS applications out here that implement the same thing. Lots of ticket management systems do it. I've got a Nuclino wiki again as an example there, where you can go and share pages. It's worse in often those. It's not often apparent unless you go right into the settings per item to see what's been shared. So a lot of people might fall victim to this and never know. With API keys, it's just that, creating API keys to enable API-based access to an account. It's not just administrator accounts that can do this. There are a lot of apps out there that support this at the general user level. I'm using Shortcut as an example here, which is a ticket management system we use. Probably 99% of users don't use it. So if you go in and create API keys there, then again, you decouple it from the account. And if you get kicked out of the account, you've still got your API key. Another very simple persistence mechanism for downstream SaaS apps. And ghost logins is similar, but with the idea that there are a lot of apps out there that support multiple login methods for the same underlying account. So it could be like Shortcut in my example, I use a social login via Google to access it, but there's still an underlying password that can be set if you'd like. So if an attacker compromised my account, they could set that local password. They can use that separately. If I don't know about that, I carry on using my Google social account, and we maintain access independently without me being aware. It's similar with social accounts for other things. If this and that is the example in the top right, I might have linked my Google account, but someone else might come in and link a Facebook or an Apple account and maintain access that way. Similar with secondary logins, I've got Expensify as an example there. You can add different email addresses. There's lots of ways to do this. Lots of apps support it. It's a nice, easy backdoor mechanism. Moving on to OAuth, slightly more technical example. This first example of it is more akin to the consent phishing example. We make our own malicious OAuth app, and then because we've already got access to the user account, we don't need to trick them to consent. We just go and consent for it ourselves, and then we've got access via OAuth. But obviously, if someone's being clever and they're looking for strange OAuth apps in their environment, you've got a good security team paying attention to that. In the same way they might detect consent phishing attacks, they might see this. But there are other options for persistence with OAuth. We can use legitimate SaaS apps. We wouldn't be able to do this for consent phishing, but we could log into something like, Canva. It's a random example, but it's got the ability to synchronize with things like OneDrive and Google Drive and provide file explorers. I could then go and connect the account I've just compromised to Canva on my own Canva account, and then someone's just going to see a Canva integration, and I can use that via Canva to browse their OneDrive in future. That's like a sort of living off the cloud approach. It doesn't look so malicious, especially if the user or the organization uses Canva as well. So it might hide in plain sight through that example. Or you can impersonate client-side apps. Not all OAuth apps are sort of protected server-side things, so they can't protect their secrets. So either they just hard-code secrets, like Thunderbird is an example, or they set themselves up as a public app. But whatever, there's nothing that can really stop someone from impersonating those apps, because they are mail clients on your phone or on your desktop or whatever. So in this case, I could say impersonate Thunderbird. And the interesting thing is, because I control the credentials, I can also request for more permissions. I'm not limited, like in Canva, of only using the GUI features it provides. In this case, rather than just access email and calendars like Thunderbird normally does, I've asked for like a whole set of permissions, and then I can access that via the API. And especially if someone is already a Thunderbird user, then it looks especially inconspicuous. So these are options for persistence using OAuth, which are pretty interesting. Okay, moving on to execution. I said this would be different before. This was one of the other ones that previously I thought, maybe execution doesn't exist. Everything in the SaaS world is kind of based on already having made functionality for you, and you not running your own code, with the exception of, like AWS Lambdas, that kind of thing, but it's, very small cases. Whereas in the traditional world, I'd be thinking of gaining native code execution, or like executing malicious scripting languages like offensive PowerShell and getting memory resident implants running. Actually, in the SaaS native world, there is an interesting equivalent here, and it's automation workflows via no-code and low-code platforms. You could maybe say OAuth tokens and API access is kind of it, because you can customize how you use them, but it's not quite the same because you're doing that from your own box. But with automation workflows, you've got something that's pretty interesting. And that is using platforms like Power Automate, Retool, Zapier, Make, Times, If This and That. There are more. I've used all of those to some extent. There are a lot more, and I've called this attack shadow workflows. It's the most code execution-like technique I'm aware of in this space, and I pretty much view it as like the offensive PowerShell SaaS now. So generally, they're based on enabling easy customizable workflows using OAuth integration to other apps. So a real simple thing with a trigger and action would be like, if a new email arrives in my Outlook inbox, please forward to my Gmail account over here. And you could set that up to then be running 24/7, coming from their servers, doing whatever custom action you want. So they're pretty powerful. And I'm going to show you an example of that shortly, but I'm going to combine it with something else. So we're going to talk about that quickly first, and then we'll see them combined together, and it will make more sense. And this is moving on to another phase as well, defense invasion. So this one I call evil twin integrations. Now, I already spoke about how you can use OAuth in different ways to be slightly stealthier and sneakier. This is like sort of extra stealth mode. And the idea is, if you integrate an app that's already in use by a user, or at least by the organization, to avoid the detection of new OAuth integrations and new user consents. So let's say someone has already integrated Zapier. They use it themselves. If you set up a brand new Zapier tenant yourself, and then you integrate that same user's account to it, because of the way OAuth works, it's not seen as a new application from, say, Microsoft's point of view. It's just an integration with the same Zapier app. There's no real distinction between tenants there. So normally you would get these logs saying, a new consent has been seen for this application and this user's done it. And so if a security team might be paying attention to brand new apps in their environment, and they might even be paying attention to new users consenting to higher risk applications. But if someone's already using it, I can, from a whole separate tenant I control, integrate their account and not generate new log files. So that's what I call an evil twin integration. It's pretty stealthy. So we're going to look at that combined with shadow workflows to make an interesting, customizable persistence technique. And the same thing goes again. I've got a pre-narrated demo. So I'm just going to play that for you now.
To demonstrate our shadow workflow and evil twin integration attack, we begin the journey by being logged in as our compromised Azure account. We don't want to lose access to this account, so we are seeking to backdoor the account to maintain persistent access beyond password changes, MFA resets, or similar response activities. The first step is to enumerate existing OAuth integrations to identify potential targets for an evil twin integration. In this example, we will use the simple GUI option of browsing the apps list in the Microsoft My Apps dashboard. Here we can see there are multiple different Zapier integrations. Zapier is a powerful SaaS automation app and a great potential target. We'll look at what permissions have been granted. Looking at the Zapier To-Do app, we can see it's been granted permissions for file access, which is very useful to us. If we switch to the Zapier Outlook integration, we can see this has been granted access to email as well, another really useful capability. Okay, so it looks like the compromised user was making use of Zapier. Before we jump to creating our own shadow workflows, let's see if we can scope out their account to understand it better. If they've been following good security practices, they probably log in via SSO or social login, so we may just be able to log in directly with their Azure account. Let's give that a try. Okay, so it worked, and we are now in their Zapier account. Let's check out their automation workflows, known as Zaps in Zapier, to see what they were doing. It looks like they have one set up for forwarding expenses that connects their Outlook to their OneDrive. That explains the file and email permissions we saw earlier. Let's double check the integrations to check they look good. Okay, we can see active OneDrive and Outlook connections, and they're for the correct user account. All looks good. At this point, we could backdoor the existing expenses workflow, or we could create a new one and possibly hide it in a different folder. However, there is always the chance that the user may discover this later, and we may get locked out of the Zapier account too. Instead, we're going to create an evil twin integration using a separate Zapier account that only we control. To do that, we'll first sign up for a new Zapier account using our own Google account. Now that we have a new Zapier account, we'll create a new Zap to automatically forward new files in their OneDrive to our own Google Drive account. To do that, we'll create a OneDrive trigger on a new file and connect it to their Azure account. We won't need to consent to any Azure permissions as they have already been granted access by the user previously. Then for the action, we'll select Google Drive and set it to upload a file and connect it to our own Google account and consent for Zapier to access it. The end result will be that Zapier monitors the compromised user's OneDrive in the background and then copies any new files and uploads them to our own Google Drive. Let's publish that and then see it in action. We'll head back to OneDrive and create a new confidential file as a test. Now that's created, we'll head over to our own Google Drive and wait. And there we go, the file has appeared. Our shadow workflow is doing its job. And because we made it an evil twin integration, there will be no logs showing a new application consent or any new permission grants either. Even when the user changes their password, we can go back to our Zapier account and create new shadow workflows using the existing integrations to perform new tasks as well. All things considered, this is a very powerful attack chain.
Okay, so we can see combining those things, you've got pretty much like the ultimate persistence technique there. You can do whatever you like, and it's pretty stealthy. So they are powerful techniques in this new space. I'm going to move briefly on to lateral movement, and then we're going to look at sort of tying a bunch of these things together into like one full attack chain. On the lateral movement side, in a traditional world, this is very much infrastructure orientated. I'm normally thinking of, you compromise one endpoint and then you move laterally to another or to a server or server to server, whatever the case. Sometimes, it might also be like Active Directory based lateral movement. Generally, we have things like credential dumping, remote service creation, software deployment tools to push code elsewhere, that kind of thing. In the SaaS world, we're talking about generally either moving from one SaaS app to another app or moving from one cloud identity to a different cloud identity. And actually, there's some pretty simple techniques for doing this. Simple but effective. Really simple things like link backdooring, abusing account recovery mechanisms, and abusing existing OAuth integrations. You'll notice OAuth keeps coming up. But also SAML jacking. We obviously saw that before, more from an initial access standpoint, but that can come in as a lateral movement perspective too. So we'll see that as well. Link backdooring, I won't spend long on this. This is very basic. But the idea is, obviously, we're normally expecting to deal with malicious links from certain potentially malicious sources, like email, as being the classic example. We're not really expecting it so much generally on trusted internal systems, and they're not really geared up for analyzing malicious links when that's the case. But if you gain access to a whole bunch of different SaaS applications that support links, like wikis and ticket systems and other things, it gives you a whole new vector for conducting internal phishing attacks. So just some examples of basic link kind of masquerading that you wouldn't normally expect to work for in secure mail gateways now, but you could do in other platforms, like just covering basic friendly text for links, or like faking the link itself, but it won't actually produce a warning in many other applications, like it would normally be blocked in by a secure mail gateway. Or even for the users that are making sure to double check everything before they click it, even simple things like, there's general truncation going on here. So you take a longer link, you register the same subdomains to your malicious domain, and then make sure they can't see the last bit. There's lots of little tricks, but the thing is, a lot of this has been covered in with secure mail gateways and other things in the past. Other applications are not really expecting to have to handle this problem, so it just gives you a lot of places to go and modify things to kind of launch further internal phishing attacks against users once you've compromised some applications. Account recovery is another basic one. If you gain access to a full cloud identity where you've got access to their email as well, or if you gain access to that via OAuth, then generally it's like a hub and spoke model. You can use that to move to lots of other applications. Often there are other passwordless logins, like Canva supports with like one-time codes to your email, or just general password reset and account recovery mechanisms. It's an easy way to move. Or you can use existing auth integrations. So we saw using Canva earlier where we set up an integration to persist, and the same in Zapier, but equally we could gain access to a poorly protected account. Maybe someone signed up with a bad password to Canva once to play with it, integrated to their OneDrive, decided they didn't use it, forgot about it, and then one day through credential stuffing we gain access to that account, find that existing integration and say, oh hey, we've got access to a OneDrive integration through this. So there's that kind of method as well. Okay, so I'm going to look at chaining a bunch of things together now. So I've been through quite a lot here and looked to sort of dive deep on certain attacks. I want to try and sort of put it together and say, let's say we do an attacker in the middle type phishing attack to try and bypass MFA against someone's core Okta tenant in this case. So it's just standard phishing, but we're going to try and bypass MFA as well. In this case, we're going to use evil no VNC as the tool. And then we want to steal some Okta credentials, like Okta SWA credentials, and then we want to use SAML and SWA to move laterally to other downstream SaaS apps, and then we want to backdoor loads of them, and then we want to try and laterally move as well. So we're going to just very briefly see how powerful it is when you combine it all together. So I have got the victim on the left, the attacker on the right. So the victim, okay, we're assuming they've already clicked the malicious link, so we've skipped the delivery. You can see there's a strange domain at the top. And now looking at an Okta login page. And on the right, we've got the attacker. Now, this is using evil no VNC. So really, the victim on the left is just remotely controlling the attacker's browser without knowing via evil no VNC. So I've brought up now on the right the attacker's actual browser. So they can actually see, like live, basically, the actions mirrored. So this victim now is entering their credentials. But the interesting thing is it's obviously their real Okta tenant because we're using an attacker in the middle technique. So they're logging in, and it's checking their password, then it's validating it's okay, and then it's prompting for MFA. And so they're going, okay, I'll use a one-time password then. They then go and get their one-time password from their app, enter that. Meanwhile, the attacker's busy just sitting there watching it go by. And then at this point, they're logged into a tenant. And that's their real tenant. They see the apps they expect to see because it's been proxied. It's not a fake one. And at this point, there's a range of things that you could do, but maybe as an attacker, it might not be the most stealthy thing, but maybe I'll just say, right, I'm going to kick them out now. I want to take back my browser. They've logged in for me, job done. So, okay, we blank out the user on the left. Now the attacker's got access on the right. They go and reveal some SWA credentials, go, okay, I've got some credentials for other systems now. I'm going to think what I want to do next. Maybe they tear down the evil no VNC connection. They've decided it served its purpose and say, okay, what else have I got out of that? Well, I'll have keylogged their password, for example, as well. That won't work on its own because of the one-time password, but I've got that. It might be useful elsewhere. But also I've obviously got the cookies from the authenticated session, so I can load those into a separate browser if I want to execute further attacks now. So that's like the first bit of compromising the identity. But the really interesting point here is what do we do next, the post-exploitation step. And that is, if I can get to skip. So here now we'll have taken those cookies, loaded them into a new browser, and now we're thinking more strategically what we're going to do. So we've already stolen some SWA credentials, and I'm going to look at sort of backdooring a few different systems. We're going to say, okay, let's log into Shortcut. It's configured via SWA. Okay, I've got an account now. I've got a valid session now on this, so could we maintain access? Okay, this has got API tokens. Let's create an API token. I'll note that down. I've backdoored access to that platform. Cool. I'll come back to that later. But let's move on. Now I'll go to the Google Drive instance. Okay, I've compromised a finance user. I see a finance folder. That's probably what I'm after for them. I'll create a sharing link. I'll note that down in my spreadsheet as well. I've got access to that. We'll come back, review it for interesting things later. Then say another example. Okay, Expensify. Maybe not that interesting an app, but they're a finance person. Okay, they're using Expensify. Let's see if we can backdoor it. Okay, it's got secondary logins. We'll add a secondary login here to a Gmail account, and we'll maintain access that way. So then we've kind of spread ourselves across that multiple accounts, backdoored in multiple ways, and made it very difficult now for an incident responder to quickly get us access out to this. They need to find all these different mechanisms. But the next step is where we want to do the lateral movement. So we say, okay, we haven't compromised like an IT admin or a security admin, but this user, they're a finance user, and actually they've got admin access to this particular application. It's often in sort of, there might be application owners that have some level of admin access to SaaS applications. In this case, maybe the finance user is actually an admin here, which means maybe they have access to some quite sensitive functionality. So this has been configured for SAML-based authentication via Okta, and that's how it's been set up. But as an attacker, I've now compromised this. Okay, I go and do SAML jacking here by changing the settings from my Okta bug crowd instance to point to the original phishing server that I used to compromise this user in the first place. And now what happens is it becomes a watering hole-based attack, where now any other users of Expensify that access it via Okta are automatically going to get SAML jacked through this. So if I go back to Okta and click on this now, I get taken to the Expensify instance, ask me to confirm the email again, and then I'm straight back to my evil no VNC based phishing attack. And then we use that to spread internally. Okay, so that just kind of shows very quickly, putting some of these things together, how it can be quite powerful when you chain them all together in the right way. And we're not touching the endpoint at all, it's just a pure identity-based attack. So I've only covered part of this that you can see on the screen today, but if this type of stuff interests you, then check this out, because this is what I produced from all the research I've done. It's called the SaaS Attacks Matrix. It's on GitHub. I'm trying to document different techniques here. It's inspired, of course, by the MITRE attack framework, if you're familiar with that, but I've done it purely on these sort of identity and SaaS-based attacks. I've been over some of them. You'll probably recognize names of ones I've talked about today, but obviously there's a lot more there too. So yeah, this is something is where I'm trying to put all this research. So check that out if it's of interest to you. If you look at any individual one, I just picked one at random here. There's generally a short description. Then I'll try and keep an example of it applying to at least one SaaS application to show it in relative references. But also, in some cases, I've done a whole bunch of blog posts where I've gone into more detail about chaining different attacks together. Like actually, those 2 YouTube videos with my pre-narrated stuff before are from 2 of those blog posts. So like, if you want to see some more detail, check out a blog post on this. Well, most of those ones are linked from techniques on the matrix if they exist. But yeah, that's the main thing that I've released that's easy to go and follow up on after this. So in terms of key takeaways, I've got these. There we go. The world is already hybrid SaaS and increasingly SaaS native, and there are many SaaS-oriented attack techniques that do not require endpoint compromises. So you've seen today how actually there's lots of things you can do to achieve quite significant compromises without ever touching an endpoint, and they can work against fully SaaS-native organizations as well as hybrid SaaS organizations. Even if you're focused on traditional endpoint compromises, like traditional red teaming kind of thing, I would still check out the persistent stuff, because that applies to most people, and it's just, like when I think back to my days dealing with detecting endpoint compromises, and I look at some of these persistent techniques now, I start thinking how much harder it would be to deal with. So both from a red teamers and blue teamers perspective, it's really important to, I think, consider those things going forwards. But yeah, just more generally, if you're a red or blue teamer or whatever the case is, and you're interested in this stuff, then check out the SaaS Attacks Matrix and see if it can help you. And otherwise, yeah, thank you. So there's the link to the matrix again. If you want to check out the blog posts, the Push Security website is there too. We do actually have a booth here, I think kiosk 5, I think it is. If you want to come and chat, I'll be around there for the rest, at different points of the rest of the conference. But yeah, otherwise, thank you very much. And if there's any questions, if we have time.